So, as I said before, if I could sing like that, my sermons would be about 3 minutes long rather than 30, right? That was beautiful, honey, and so aligned with our talk topic for today. I am celebrating the opportunity to come before you today and share with you about the 5 basic unity principles. Today we'll be launching the first of this 5-part series that's going to last all the way through December. So what's awesome about that is in between, for me, I have to process stuff. So I like the fact that, my talks will have spaces in between that you can come home and practice these principles in your lives. And just to give you a little bit of background on the 5 basic unity principles, when people hear that, especially from other traditions, their first tendency is to be like, ooh, I think principles, I think dogma. And to the contrary, it's quite the opposite in unity. In fact, when Charles Fillmore was asked to summarize the teachings of unity, he actually refused to do so. And it was only 100 years later that his great-granddaughter, Connie Fillmore, after people pled with her, because people were like, we want a little bit of clarity here, you've been teaching this stuff for years. It's been transforming people's lives. We want something that we can bring to all the unity churches. And so Connie Fillmore then wrote down these 5 basic unity principles, and they caught on like wildfire. Churches adopted them and started using them. And so that's the history of these. But I want to make sure you know that, so that you know that these are just a way of summarizing. People are looking around going, what is it we're doing that's working? What is it that works? Let's put that down so we can share that more readily with others. But that doesn't mean this is a forever statement. This is a living document, if you will. So with that, I'll begin. If you want to move the slide to the next, with my talk for today, which is on the first power. So as you can see, the title of my talk today is admittedly a little bit obscure and unusual. But the thing is, when ideas come to me in meditation, as I was meditating on today's talk, when they come to me, and particularly when they relate to pie, or when they're irrational, I will follow that thought train, because I know that that will take me where my conscious mind generally does not advise me to go. And then when I go into the mystery of where that takes me, then gems and insights reveal themselves to me. So, as I entered into the mystery of what on earth this could be about, I discerned that there were 2 stories from my life that relate to the first basic unity principle. And the first is an actual personal story 2 years ago, when a friend in ministerial school actually gifted me with a pumpkin pie. We'll talk about that story later, an actual pie. And then, of course, some of you might recognize this title theme. There's a story out there. It was actually written in 2001 by Jan Martel. And it's about the life of this kid, this teenager named Pi. He was actually born Piscine, the name Piscine, but naturally he wanted to change his name, so he picked Pi. And what's interesting about that word is that actually was intentionally the mathematical number pi, which is an irrational number, and which goes into infinity, right? So Life of Pi, if you haven't already seen the movie or read the book, is actually a spiritual allegory. And so I'll talk about that in a second. So I want to reveal sort of just enough about the story, Life of Pi, to make my point, but not so much that I ruin it for all of you who haven't seen it. So in Life of Pi, the protagonist, Pi, is this Indian boy from Pondicherry who's found, he's a survivor, stranded on a lifeboat in the Pacific Ocean, right? And he's found with this tiger named Richard Parker, and he's found like, say, 200 plus days after the ship was already shipwrecked. So this is kind of a miracle. So when he's interviewed by these officials about the incident, Pi shares this amazing tale with them. He weaves this tale about being on this lifeboat with a hyena, a zebra, an orangutan, and this Bengal tiger named Richard Parker. And so the story is a little bit violent. In his story, as he relates it, these animals apparently kind of kill each other one by one, biggest, eating the little guy, until finally the only ones left on the lifeboat are Pi and this tiger. So he talks about how he lures the tiger into submission by fishing and then feeding him fish, and so positively reinforcing his submission. So the tale goes on. There's one night of despair in which Pi has this spiritual moment. He's almost on the brink of dying, and he looks up into the stars. And so in the story, we hear these, beautiful tale of dancing with the tiger, and we hear this beautiful tale of looking up into the stars and having like a God experience moment. And I am just totally wrapped and absorbed in the story until I read further and I realize the officials that he's talking to aren't so convinced. So they're kind of looking at him going, kind of skeptically. And so Pi just turns around, tells him a different story. He just turns around, makes up a new story. He says in this new story that in fact, there weren't animals on the boat. It was all people, including like my mother. And again, kind of a morbid story, the people ended up surviving by eating one another until the only person left was Pi. That was his second story. And so the thing is, ultimately, no one can prove, right, either of these stories. So Pi then asks the officials, which story do you prefer? The officials think for a moment and they say, we like the one with the animals, right? And Pi thanks them and says, and so it is with God. According to the book's author, Martel, the life of Pi can be summed up in these three statements. 1, life is a story. 2, you can choose your own story. And 3, a story with God is a better story. Unity minister Reverend Ellen Davenport, who wrote the book, The 5 Principles on the 5 Basic Unity Principles, summarizes the first basic unity principle like this: God is absolute good, everywhere present. But then in her book, in the same chapter, she also, interestingly enough, encourages us to continually redefine, tell ourselves a new story about God. And at one point in her book, she actually says, are we allowed to make up our own God? Of course, she says. It's called theology. Yeah, ministerial students love this one. But I have to admit, I have this strong urge for truth. And so I balk a little bit about this notion of making up a story about God. But as I reflected on this, the truth of it is, my experience is what it is. It doesn't need to be proven. It simply is. It's beingness. But as soon as I tell you about my experience, I'm telling you a story. So the question is, what story am I going to tell about my experience? And then I reflected further on this, and I realized one of my favorite quotes, which is on my Facebook page, so that means I really love it, is by A Course in Miracles teacher Gary Renard. And he says that everything except God is a metaphor. Everything except existence itself is really just a symbol, a story, a song, a piece of art about existence. And in that same chapter, discussing the first basic unity principle, Ellen Davenport says, if I had one wish for the world, it would be that every adult re-examine his or her view of God at least once per decade. God may not change, but people do. And we outgrow our old concepts. So in her book, which has become actually, again, a fairly commonly used text among Unity churches, they use it in book studies and for sermons, Davenport notably, number one, does not tell us that we have to believe everything that she says about the first basic unity principle. And on top of that, she admits that other people in unity will almost certainly have different interpretations of those principles. So I just wanted to share that on the front end. Yet at the same time, she does think something that I think is absolutely essential, that with any living, any alive spirituality, that we must engage in this important conversation with ourselves and with others about God, about the nature of existence, so that what we have here in the unity movement, in our unity communities, is a living and alive spirituality. So for that reason, I think setting up the brown bag discussion after is my way of inviting you into this discussion. So it's not just me here telling you what God is, but me inviting you, asking you to engage this question, because our stories matter, because they frame our experience of reality and of the divine. Today's talk, I'll begin by sharing my own personal evolution, if you will, around this concept of God. And then additionally, I'll share about how even before I could believe fully my concept of God, I was able to use that larger concept to transform my life. So those two things today. So first point. For me, at least, God or reality doesn't change, that truth thing. But my concepts have certainly changed over time. As many of you already know from prior talks, my conscious spiritual journey began in the 12-step rooms. And I remember vividly the very night that I hit bottom in my life. I, who was normally very, my lawyerly, very poised self, had been bawling for about 3 hours straight. I mean, I could not stop crying. I had broken. Something in me just shattered. So there I was in my room crying, and my boyfriend at the time, again, this was 10 years ago, after letting me cry for like a long, long time, he turns to me, and he was in AA at the time, Alcoholics Anonymous, and he says, "Nhien, do you have a God?" And that just stopped me in my tracks, and I'm like, huh. And I stopped sniffling for a while, and he says, because if you don't, you can use mine. Yeah, really sweet. I was very touched, but I'm like, I do have a God, or at least I did in my childhood. But I abandoned that God really because I thought that God had abandoned or rejected me, because I did believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, and basically that meant that my entire Buddhist family, all of my gay friends, and definitely me a few times twice over, were basically barred from heaven, right? If I believed that God, I was basically damned. So I kind of got lost for a while, and I stopped thinking that I believed in anything. So when I entered 12-step just a week later, one of the first things that my sponsor had me do was redefine God on one page. And then the next thing she had me do was, in the first 3 steps, really grapple with my relationship to God, the God of my being, the God of my understanding. And so, interestingly enough, during that time, and I'm looking at what God has been to me, and I realized God has all the same traits as all of my primary caregivers. God is punitive, God is conditionally loving, and God is generally disapproving of me. Illuminating. And then I got to redefine God, and I actually pulled out my redefinition of God recently. It's just one sheet of paper. I've kept it all these years, and it's one of the definitions is my higher power. In 12-step we call it higher power. My higher power is all-embracing. My higher power is the summer sun on my bare skin. My higher power is a steady flame inside of me. My higher power is not only inside of me, but my higher power is bigger than me. And I started to live from this new definition of God. And then a year later, I found unity. And then at that unity in Marin, I heard that song that Victor just sang, one power, one presence. And then I read the first basic unity principle. And each church summarizes it differently, and this is the way I learned it, and it will be ingrained in my being forever. There is only one power and one presence active in my life and in the world. God the good, in all, through all, and over all. This truth began to work its way in me and started to transform my life. And that leads to my second point for today. Being willing to believe and then living from the truth of that principle, principle one, absolutely transformed the way I relate to my world and to myself, transformed my life to bring greater love, greater harmony in my relationships, brought greater prosperity also. So let's talk about this principle a little bit more first. This principle maintains, again, that all of us are one with God, that it is in God that we live and move and have our infinite being. And yet it is also in us that God lives and moves and has expression. God is immanent, that is to say within me, but God is also transcendent, outside of me. But in a way, God is also none of those. Because if there's only one of us, there is no inside or outside. There is just being. All of this is true according to unity. And all of this is a truth that every day I seek to unfold in my very being. Principle one is vast. It's a concept of God that is so powerful. To me, there are ideas of God that are more like boxes that we have to fit in. And there are ideas about God that are more like trestles on which we can flourish like as vines, right? This is an idea of God that to me is more like a trestle. Davenport says of principle one, it allows her to know God in new ways and to stretch her understanding of all that is. God is absolute good, everywhere present. And again, God this principle can transform my life, even if I totally don't quite believe it all right now. Because you know what? I say that I believe in this first basic unity principle, right? Because I believe in it intellectually. It matches my sense of justice. It matches my sense of love. I believe it with my heart and my mind. But frankly, I'm still seeing you as separate beings. So in that, I know I have some work to do. But that said, as long as I am willing to believe and then willing to live as if this were true, the principle somehow works to transform my life. And I have a specific example of this. So what follows from the idea that there's only one power, one presence, is that no one is against me, right? There's no opposing power. There's no devil. There's no demon. There's just me, the infinite. So I was first introduced to this idea that nothing is against me by my minister back at Unity in Marin. And I was totally new to church at the time. I'd only been there a year, but somehow I was invited into leadership. I was on the board, serving as a chaplain. I was teaching classes. And in all of that, I, who used to live very solitary, was thrust into a world of people. And people disagree, even in churches. And yeah, I know. And even when you have the highest intentions in mind, there's disagreement, and then you think you have this goal and someone else has a different goal, and it feels like it's in opposition. What do you do? So he gave me this book. It's by Gary Simmons, who was a Unity-trained minister. It's called Eye of the Storm, I rather than EYE. Embracing Conflict, Creating Peace. In it, Gary Simmons tells a story of being counseled by a Hindu teacher who spoke these words to him. No one is against you. You have no adversary in your life. There is nothing in the universe that is against you or your purpose. Make your path about proving this truth, and you will discover what wholeness really is. No one is against you. You have no adversary in your life. There is nothing in the universe that is against you or your purpose. Make your path be about proving this truth, and you will discover what wholeness really is. So I started to practice this. I, who used to live in a world that was cold, in which I was an alien and no one ever helped me do anything, started to live in a world in which I started just receiving things for free from people. People would just give me things. People would offer to help. My world started to change, in which the world, I look around and I see a room of helpers. That's a different world. But we're not just helping me, we're helping this greater purpose that is coming through, being expressed through me, through you, through each of you. My world started to change, and by the time I got my call to ministry, I've been practicing this principle that no one and nothing is against me, and in fact, let's take it a step further and say everything is for me. I was practicing that principle, and then I got my call to ministry, and I have to say, I was so excited. I went into my law office the next day, and I said, I'm going to ministerial school, and I was ready to quit. I was ready to quit, like right then. And my supervising attorney looks at me and was like, well, that's great news, Nhien. I'm happy for you, but you're not in school yet. So why don't you keep working for us? So I'm like, oh, okay. And so why don't you, I was like, well, but I have to take SEE classes. There were a lot of, it's like, well, why don't you submit a proposal to us? And so I went home and I'm like, oh, how am I going to do this? I'm a lawyer. Lawyers are great negotiators, right? Thinking about the other side. And so how am I going to do this from the perspective that we're all on the same side? No one is against me and everyone is for me. And I sat with that. And I was like, I just need to be clear what I need to be supported along this path. That's it. I'm not going to propose a super high number so that knowing they're going to come back and try to push it down. I'm going to propose exactly what I feel I'm called to ask for, and that's it. And so I did that. I wrote terms in there. I basically said I want the same amount of money that I'm making, and I want to work from home. That's basically what I told them. And of course, I was peaceful in that moment. But then after I submitted it, I was like, oh God, maybe I asked for too much, or a little bit. There's, we have those moments. So I'm just like, okay, no, but this is what I need. This is what's right. So I sit there, and it takes days. After a few days, the managing partner knocks on my door, my office, and and I invite him in, of course. And he sits down, and, like lawyers do. And he says, "So Nhien, how does it feel to get everything you want?" God is good all the time. So yes. Where was I? Oh. Wow, huh? This stuff works. And in the Unity Classic, What Are You? Imelda Shanklin explains some of this by saying, the essence of non-resistance is unity. You are not isolated from the rest of the universe. You are an indispensable part of the universe, and as such, the universe loves, protects, and cherishes you. And so caring for you, the universe is self-preserving. You are safe. You are inconceivably valuable. Nothing opposes you. You are in the midst of friends. So we can apply this as a preventative measure, like before asking for a raise maybe. But we can also apply it when it looks like we already have an opposition, an obstacle, something in our path. We can apply this by remembering that principle of love, oneness, unity, that we are on the same side, the side of truth, the side of goodness, the side of God. We are all here to express that one truth, that one living truth. Mark Nepo, if you were there for World Day of Prayer, I know some of you might have been there, for the opening talk of this year, said, the best chance to be whole is to love whatever gets in the way until it ceases to be an obstacle. One power, one presence, and we're it. But don't think that I forgot about the pie. Pumpkin pie. In closing, I want to bring our attention back to that pumpkin pie that I mentioned earlier. So when I moved to Unity Village in fall of 2012, I didn't know anybody, I didn't have any friends. And I made a friend really quickly, a classmate named Jackie Linotti. And, you know, really cute. We'd go to the Unity Inn, our school cafeteria, together and eat each day. And, but one day, she comes like with this bag, and she presents me with this pumpkin pie. And I kind of look around, I'm like, that's for me? And she's like, yeah. And, you know, I was with my friend Jennifer last night. She loves to bake. She baked me a pie, and so I asked her to bake you a pie. I'm like, really? And so, you know, I'm a really studious and serious student, right? And so here I am walking around the halls of Unity carrying this pie, and all I could do in all my articulate eloquence, I was like, I got a whole pie. I got a whole pie. You know, and Jackie was just like, she was cracking up. She couldn't understand. She's like, well, you know, I know you like pie, but this is kind of ridiculous, right? But I kept saying that in my mind. I got a whole pie. And, you know, it wasn't until later, upon reflection, that I really understood why this was so important to me. See, in my childhood, I was one of 5 kids in an immigrant family where everything had to be divvied up, sliced up, and shared. My parents' love, every pizza, cake. You know, I wore hand-me-downs. So this moment was kind of this moment of realizing that there was going to be enough for me, you know? Like I was going to have everything that I needed. That wholeness of life, that all God, all good, all resources were mine. All good, all God, the whole pie is here for all of us. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is our current concept of God big enough for us to receive the whole pie? And if it's not, are we willing to live into, practice that concept, to enlarge that notion? So please join me today in our brown bag as we have this discussion. Thank you and bless you.